I've been wanting to make for a while a sort of lessons learned from the hurricane from Helene, which is coming up on just about a year ago. So I figured I'd finally put some thoughts down and walk through all the things we learned, some things we wish we'd known, all that kind of stuff. Just so everyone's aware, we're in the northern part of Buncombe County, so we're outside of the city. Thankfully, we're not quite in Madison, and we learned quite a bit, So before we get into it, just to let people know, what this is and isn't going to be. This is by no means, a zombie apocalypse prepper video. Hardly that. It's not a universal prep video or a list of here's all the things that you need to buy. It's more a narrative of the things that we did have, the precautions we had taken, the things that we wish we had had, the things that we found useful, that sort of stuff. It applies really specifically to us in our situation here, which I'll give more detail on, and this specific hurricane. The video is going to be very, very storm and flood centric. This is not how to deal with civil unrest or, the nuclear holocaust or any of this other kind of craziness. We were very lucky as well in terms of season, and that saved us from a lot of issues, right? It happened in the fall, which around here, fall is very, very temperate, 70 degrees during the day, high 50s at night. And so things like staying warm or staying cool were not concerns that really anybody had for the first significant portion of the storm and of the recovery. Certainly as we got into later October and plenty of people were still isolated at that point, things like staying warm started to become a real concern. But in the acute phase, really that 1 to 3 weeks post-storm, there was not a lot of concern about that. The perspective that we're coming from on this is we're homeowners. We have a decent amount of property up here, like I said, in North Buncombe, pretty rural area. We live down a dead end holler, and know all our neighbors, all that kind of stuff. I'm by no means a crazy prepper, but we also were not unprepared. I have enough, survival training to a certain degree and general level of understanding of things that we were not caught totally with our pants down on this whole operation. So with that kind of out of the way, I want to get into a couple of the 5 or 6 different sections on some different aspects of the storm. The first and probably the biggest piece here, honestly, is, and it's going to be very unsatisfying for a lot of people, but the first piece here is knowledge. And I really can't emphasize enough how much knowledge was super critical for us and how many things it made easier. I have always approached virtually my entire life from the perspective of how can I be as useful as possible? How can I understand the most? How can I fit as much information into my head across as many areas and systems as I possibly can? Now, I'm in IT by profession, and throughout my adult life, I've done everything I can to understand. We've built houses, we've remodeled houses, I've repaired cars, repaired motorcycles, we've built bridges, built cabins, designed electrical systems, and everything in between. So I came to this with a not insignificant amount of knowledge, and that knowledge was immensely helpful across so many different things. It really informed a lot of the responses we were able to provide to things, and prepared us in a lot of ways to be useful. So another piece I would say here is, and this is straight lessons learned, is to understand all your critical systems. You don't have to be an architect or an engineer or a plumber or an electrician, any of those things. You don't have to have a professional level of knowledge about those things, but you should have some. You should be able to know, where's the shutoff for the water for your house. You should know if you're on a well or if you're on a septic, right? You should know where the breakers in your electrical panel are and broadly how they work. And so many people we came across just had a really astoundingly low level of understanding of anything about how any of the systems around them worked, right? Where's the electricity come from? Where does the magic internet come from? Things like this was really surprising what people did and didn't know. Personally, something that bit me is we have a not uncomplex setup at our house, which I'll detail later on here. And I have gotten definitely complacent in terms of paper documentation, of having things written down. Just for a simple example, we have 3 different electrical service panels in our house between solar and generator and the mains. And I had stopped keeping the breaker diagrams, the physical paper breaker diagrams, updated because I moved to using a Google Sheet, a spreadsheet for them a year or 2 ago. And now that came back to bite me because I had to go and, dig up the old paper copies and double check and things like that. So having paper documentation for critical systems and processes was a deficiency of ours and something we could have done much better. One thing we did do in that capacity that was very helpful was at the time we had a generator set up, and I had documented on paper, mostly for my wife if I was out of town, exactly what to do to cut over to the generator. And we have a manual interlock and a couple of things, but it's a series of steps. And I had printed that all out and laminated it, and it was pinned to the panel. So that was really good. But I wish I had that for some of our other systems. So if you learn nothing else from this, make sure that you have documented how to do the things that you are going to need to do, the systems in your house. All right, I figure I should get this one out of the way here pretty early so that everyone can tune out when they get angry. But let's talk about community. And man, this is something I hear a lot about. You watch any of these other, prepper survival videos, or even a couple of the ones I've seen about Helene from folks in the area. And there is endless fixation and waxing on about, oh my gosh, the community is so important. It's so important, all these things. And I get there's probably some social pressure to virtue signal about, not being just out for yourself or whatnot. But broadly, I do not buy as much of the community is the criticality line. Primarily because a community is people. And those people need to individually be ready, right? And be prepared and be useful. Because a community full of useless people is of no help to anybody, including themselves. They are, if anything, a detriment. They're a strain on the professional and municipal support systems and things like that. So just having a community and being friendly and whatever with your neighbors, which obviously we certainly are, and it was lovely, but you yourself need to be ready and useful and prepared, right? You want to be the one who can go help, not the one that needs to wait for help. And I understand not everyone's going to be in that situation. People have disabilities, the elderly, things like that. And I honestly understand that. But if you're physically able, you need to be the one who can go out and help people, not the one who's sitting around waiting to be rescued. A big piece as well, and I saw a lot of this, right, is I would advise everybody, and we certainly did this, don't go out of your way to be helpful. And that sounds callous, but don't do it to the degree that you end up putting yourself at unnecessary risk, right? And this is predominantly for the men listening. And we all, want to think we're firefighters and mountain rescue experts and tree removal, especially down here in the South, right? There's the hold my beer mentality as we cut the tree down. And you got to make sure that when all other things and systems are intact and running and operational and available, it's okay to sort of take some risks in the form of doing things that are maybe outside your direct expertise. But when those systems are already strained or broken, you want to only do the things that you can do safely, right? You don't want to risk, hey, I'm going to cut this tree down that's leaning over the house, and oh, whoops, it went away I didn't expect, and it hit me, and now I need emergency services. And brother, those emergency services are not available. So you don't want to be those people. And I had friends who very much went out and, dove into it head first and did all they could and above what they probably could and should have done. I know at least one for whom that they were bitten by that, and plenty weren't as well. So there's a balance there. Do what you can do safely. The piece that I think also is important is you want to take care of yourself and your family so that you don't become a burden to emergency services, to the people who are really trying to save lives. Obviously, we had the National Guard, we had everybody here. You don't want to be doing things or putting yourself in a situation where you are putting an additional strain on those systems, an additional unnecessary strain, right? People have a terrible time being bored. A lot of times you just need to sit and be bored and not go out and do things that are going to cause additional problems. They're going to make the situation worse, essentially. Speaking of ways to make things worse, I do want to cover the gun subject, firearms, because that's always a central fixture of all the prepping stuff and how you need to have an arsenal and all these things. For us, this was not a giant change. I'm a concealed carry holder. I'm an NRA concealed carry instructor. Firearms are a very comfortable, common thing for us here. I always carry all the time anyway, so it wasn't really a change. The point here is that you don't want to be Rambo. No one needs to be walking around with their AR, right? Or, open carrying some big preposterous duty pistol or something like this. There was no, hunting to live and all this kind of madness. Weaponry for us was, like I said, it wasn't a change in the first place, but it was a caution. It was from a purely defensive perspective. You can never really know people until you see them in stressful situations. And you can never really know how people are going to react to those things. And people react in ways that you would never imagine to stress. It's really fascinating. And some people really rise and prove to be far more altruistic than you would expect. And other people do the opposite. So the advice in similar situations I would have for everybody is for those who are trained, competent, and can safely and legally own and carry a handgun, in a situation like this, I would do so everywhere, all the time. And it's an unfortunate reality because bad people will. People who mean ill have weapons, no matter what laws are passed. This is obviously a big topic. Bad people will always have a way to get guns. And correspondingly, in situations where those folks are going to be more prevalent, where people who might not have been those people become those people, you want to be able to defend yourself. That is just a reality. We didn't, thankfully, have problems up here. Again, smaller, a little more rural communities did not. We didn't have looting or anything. But obviously a lot of places, especially down in Asheville, definitely Hendersonville, Asheville, a lot of places had significant problems. You can drive by 26 on the River Arts District there, and you can still see, spray painted signs on buildings that say looters will be shot. So it was a thing. It did exist. All right, so getting into some of the fun stuff here, I want to talk about power, because power was a huge piece. Obviously, power was out. We were very fortunate. We're on French Broad Electric. They got our power back. Those folks were absolute heroes. They got our power back, I think, 8 days, 10 days, something like that. So we really weren't that hard up. That said, this is probably the area for which we were best prepared. We had gone to the effort just a year ago of putting in some solar. And, we designed our solar system pretty with a lot of thought, and frankly, it served us well. We had enough solar power and a small battery not a small battery, a pretty significantly sized, a 5,000 watt hour lithium battery that allowed us to power our critical loads. And the critical load piece is something that was, again, this goes to the preparation and knowledge piece. So we had isolated our critical loads. We knew what they were and we had planned for it. We're on a well here, so we knew we wanted to run a well pump. We have two or three chest freezers, or two chest freezers rather, and a refrigerator with a freezer. We knew we wanted to power that. We knew we wanted to power some of our basic, digital infrastructure, our Wi-Fi and internet for all the good that did. So we knew what we wanted to do, and I had sized our very, very basic solar setup to power those things. I did have a pretty good learning experience to watch out for the parasitic or vampire loads, because those absolutely do exist. I've got a pretty substantial infrastructure here from a networking perspective that had grown over time, and at rest, cumulatively was pulling something like 600 watts, just chilling out. And so a portion of what we had to do was, when I saw what that was doing to the runtime on our batteries, and obviously it was overcast too, so the panels weren't doing tremendously. We had to pare back. I had to take down a lot of that infrastructure such that we only really had, an access point, a router, and our modem. But watch for those parasitic loads. Have your critical systems isolated. There's a bunch of electrical ways to do this. We did a sub panel connected to the solar inverter and things like that. But that really was critical for us. We did have a generator, and we used it once to top the batteries up when the sun just hadn't shone for, I think, an entire day. And generators are great, right? Have a generator. There's no reason to not have a generator, but a couple things just to keep in mind about them. So they're loud, number one. And this is maybe a little more on the paranoid prepper side, but they're loud, and they let everybody know that you have a generator. And everybody will know that you have a generator, you are prepared, you probably have fuel, all those kinds of things. So that's just something to keep in mind from, a vulnerability perspective, is that you are announcing to your neighborhood, to your neighbors, hey, I've got stuff. So keep that in mind. Obviously, keep in mind too that they need gas, and we had enormous gas shortages here, as everybody knows. 26 north, 40 east and west were gone. Couldn't get tankers in. Everybody panic buys gas. There were people who were running out of gas for the generators. So don't be in that situation either. I'll talk a little more about fuel later on. And then finally, if you have a generator, that's great that you have a generator. You bought one and it's sitting in the garage. That's super. Make sure you have a way to power some portion of your panel, again, to know your critical loads. For people, if you're on city water, this is less of a concern, because for the most part, if you're on city water, almost all of your critical loads in your house are going to be 120, right? They're going to be it's going to be refrigerators, a freezer, some lights, and stuff like that. Things that in a pinch you can just run a big extension cord from your fridge out the window to the generator and plug it in, and that's fine. But for folks, and this was everybody in our part of the county here, have wells, and well pumps are all split phase 240. Now, 95% of generators have outputs for split phase 240. It's the big whacking 3 or 4 prong plug on them. The problem is you can't just run an extension cord to your well. So I ran out of I literally ran out of pigtails and counts for the number of generators that I helped people backfeed, right? All 3 or 4 of my neighbors, I helped set up their generators to backfeed. And in doing so, I did pull main breakers from those folks, right? So we pulled main breakers so that they could not accidentally energize the grid. We talked through the basics of how backfeeding works and what to do and not to do. But without doing that, having a well doesn't matter a whole hill of beans if you have no way to power that well pump with the generator. So just make sure that if you have a generator, you have a way to power your hardwired loads for the house. And obviously the best way to do that, or a really good way to do that, the most common, is a standard transfer switch, a multi-circuit transfer switch. And I know they're expensive and electrician has to put them in and everything. Another option, which is how we have ours set up, is a whole panel manual interlock, so that essentially we can switch the entire panel between either grid feed or generator feed. It's cheaper, it's simpler, it's still perfectly safe. There's a lot of ways to solve that problem, but just if you have a generator, make sure you have thought about how you're going to actually hook it up to the loads in your house. So right adjacent to power has to be communication. Communication was a really, that was probably one of the biggest surprises for us. Right, we live in a rural area. We have landline cable internet here, and it goes out periodically. So we have enough cell service here at the house that I had always just written off any kind of redundant communication in terms of out to the outside world. Right, so internet. When I'm saying communication in this case, I'm talking the internet for this instance. So I had not prepared any kind of backup, and as everybody knows, we had a cell outage here. There was no, and this wasn't the same everywhere. Some folks on some carriers were okay. We had no cell service, 0. We could not make 911 calls. We couldn't do anything. And then there's still some argument about whether or not the carriers actually had, whether the towers themselves went down or the carriers deliberately put outages on them to keep people from saturating them. Unclear, and I'm not going to speculate there. But they were out, so we couldn't communicate. So big lesson learned for us, which we've now corrected, is Starlink. And we're so fortunate to have, Starlink was great and provided that service for free for, I think, 3 months. And I was more than happy to drop the kit at the time. I think it was $200, something like that. And granted, our internet cell service specifically had returned by the time I put up the Starlink, but that has now become a fixture here for us. And I run it. I do have dual WAN coming in here. We've got both cable and Starlink now, but I'm at the point where I run Starlink as our primary and may cancel the cable at some point. So absolutely wish we had satellite in that capacity. And by the time this comes out, or somebody in the future is listening to this, or the next disaster occurs, more and more phones now have quote unquote satellite uplink. And so that standard terrestrial, radio to tower communication will likely become less critical than it was. But for us, that was a big piece. Talking shorter distances, two-way radios, and I was very prepared in this capacity. We had some good, short and long wave stuff, and they were great, but they were not really maybe as critical as I would have thought they were, predominantly because most people don't have them, and so it was mostly, they were nice to have. We used them predominantly inside the neighborhood, so my wife and I could stay in contact as I was either up on the upper part of our property or out in the neighborhood helping our neighbors do stuff. We could stay in contact, and that's really about the range they've got. You could buy whatever set of radios on Amazon that say they've got a 20-mile range. They're out of their minds, especially in the mountains here. No chance. Right? We were lucky to get a half mile down the road with all the woods and hills, and all the iron and red clay in these hills just block RF like crazy. So they were great, but they were not nearly as critical as I thought they would be. A piece that we dropped the ball on hugely, honestly, was an AM/FM radio. And this, I think, is on everybody's list. But man, what I would have given for a battery-powered AM/FM radio. One of the stations near here, I forget which one exactly, they were the only people broadcasting for days. And they were holed up there in their broadcast studio with a big diesel generator. And they were getting people as many updates as they could. And, I'd go out and run my car for 5 or 10 minutes at a time to listen to the updates. And then when the county finally got their act together, and as soon as FEMA got the heck out of the way, that's where a lot of updates were coming through. And I had to go out to the car and run burn gas. And man, wish I had just a standard AM/FM radio. I want to come back to fuel, because I talked about generators there a little bit ago, and so I want to come to the fuel side of things, because this is another important one when it comes to preparation and how it impacted things. Like I mentioned, there was gasoline shortages, lines. You didn't want to be one of the people waiting 4 hours for 5 gallons of gas. So a couple different parts of this. One is what we had done previously and already, and some things that we wish we'd done, and that sort of thing. From a preparation perspective, we made the decision years ago when we overhauled our house to move to propane for as much as we could. So we have a 250-gallon propane tank here at the house, which I think we have Blossman, and they're great. They keep that thing topped up all the time. And we have a gas range, and we have an on-demand propane hot water heater. That was a critical piece of preparation that paid off in spades, because between having a little bit of solar and power to run the well pump and an on-demand propane water heater, which does require electricity but pulls all of 40 watts or something like that to run its fan, we had hot showers. And this is where we were so fortunate throughout this whole thing is, we didn't go a single night of Helene without a hot shower. And that is so radically more fortunate than the vast majority of the folks in the area. But again, it was down to some strategic thinking earlier, right? So having propane, it was a huge piece. The heating the house, obviously, like I mentioned at the outset, was not as big an issue, wasn't an issue at all for us, frankly, because it was a very temperate time of year. But the rest of the year, even in the dead winter, obviously we have air conditioning and we have an HVAC, and we do have a heat pump. We could run it in reverse. And we have heat coils even, which are electric heat, but we never use it. We have a wood stove insert in our fireplace, and we heat our house every day of the year that we need it. We heat it with wood, and that is a type of fuel, obviously. So we did have plenty of that on hand if we'd had to. Could certainly have heated the house with wood. I know there were many a house around here once some of the cold started really to kick in that busted out wood stoves that had not been used in a long time, or burning wooden fireplaces and things like that. So that was a big piece. The sort of offline fuel sources, right? Not just using electricity for heating everything, for example. On the gasoline subject, and this is another one where we were reasonably prepared. We have a decent amount of property, so I go through a lot of gas. So I've always got 3 to 5 5-gallon gas jugs, and diesel as well, hanging around. And it was really, really critical for us. We didn't have any issues with running out of gas for the generator or chainsaws or anything like that. The advice I would give to folks, if you're going to get in the business of trying to have gas on hand, is do not, unless you're going to be ultra disciplined in rotating it, don't just go to the pump and put regular, 87 into a gas can, because all the ethanol and all the other garbage they put in fuel, it gels over time. It'll gunk up and destroy the carbs in your generators. It's not good. If you're going to, hoard, quote unquote, fuel, if you're going to stockpile gasoline, make sure you're getting high octane ethanol free. And this isn't available in every area, but I guarantee that unless you're in the middle of the city, there is a gas station, and it's probably the crunchy looking one with the guy with no teeth that you don't want to go to because you're better than that or whatever. But one of those gas stations is going to have ethanol free gas, and it's typically off to the side. It's maybe not on the regular pumps. Here we do have it on regular pumps. It's going to be more expensive, but it's higher octane, and again, it has no ethanol. So by virtue of not having any ethanol, it just de facto lasts far longer than standard out of the pump, 87 octane gasoline. So if you're going to stockpile fuel, you use that 93 or ethanol free, and throw some fuel stabilizer in there if you really feel like it. That will definitely help. Another piece was, keeping the vehicles fueled. We discovered we have a large passenger van with a 36-gallon fuel tank, and so we always keep it pretty topped up. And honestly, I had thought, oh yeah, if we ever need fuel, gasoline, I can always just siphon from that tank because it's enormous. Well, come to find out, we should have looked into this earlier, at least on ours, they have anti-siphon mechanisms built in. So there is no way to snake a siphon pump down into the gas tank of a lot of modern vehicles. So we had 30, 35, 36 gallons of fuel sitting in our van that we could not use. And obviously, thankfully, had other fuel sitting in cans. But if that had been our sole plan, that would have been a significant bummer. So again, if you're going to stockpile gas, make sure it's ethanol free, and rotate it regularly if you can. So that's what we do here. We rotate the fuel. I have my cans all dated, and as I'm mixing new fuel or putting fuel into motorcycles or whatever, we use the oldest first and we rotate through. You should do the same. Quickly, because it's right related to gasoline, would be transportation. And you want to stay, and we had, and it really served us well. Some people had troubles, stay on top of your vehicle maintenance, right? It's not a help to have a vehicle that can, for example, we did have this problem. I have a dirt bike, and it had a stone dead battery. So I was excited to be able to get the dirt bike out, and whoops, cooked battery. Now, thankfully, I was able to put it on a trickle and bring it back to life, but that could as well have been a completely stone dead battery, at which point the thing's a paperweight. So keep on top of the vehicle maintenance. Make sure you're riding or driving or using things that you're going to rely on, with some regularity, so that they, oil stays circulating, fuel doesn't gel, all those kinds of things. I mentioned it earlier, making sure you're not running your vehicles all the way down from a gasoline perspective. Don't run that tank to empty. Make sure you've always got, enough gas to be able to get somewhere and back again. On the slightly more prepper-ish side, and again, this is more relevant for a flood with downed trees in a rural area, but man, having a 4x4 of some type was fantastic. We had a Wrangler at the time, and, with big whacking tires and 4-wheel drive and a manual transmission and all that. And we could absolutely go places that other people could not. Not even crazy places, right? But, the ability to, hey, there's a giant, or not a giant, there's a 5-6 inch tree across the road. The ability to drive over that, as opposed to being in a, in a Corolla or a Accord or something, and having that be a complete stopper, or having to, get out and cut it or something like that. That was immense, having that. And so if you're in a rural area, things like side-by-sides, North Carolina's cool. You can drive side-by-sides with a plate on them on the roads now. So having a side-by-side or a four-wheeler or something like that, or heck, even a dirt bike, obviously just keep the battery charged, would definitely be beneficial. Make sure that your transportation solution is not dependent upon perfect driving conditions. Since I just talked about transportation, I figured that would be a good sort of segue into just a general equipment conversation. Some things that worked well for us. I mentioned earlier, we're very DIY, try to be as useful as possible. We had every tool, I could obviously ever imagine here. I would recommend everybody, have a basic complement of homeowner tools, right? Have screwdrivers and wrenches and hammers and pry bars and these sorts of things. Like those to me are the absolute basics. You want to be able to open your electrical panel. You want to be able to service things, fix stuff. You don't want to be, I had a friend who drove over here because they didn't have a screwdriver. Like, this was, hey, would you have like one of those star-shaped screwdrivers? Like, you mean a Phillips? Yeah, that. I'm like, yeah, man, I do. So just have a basic complement of homeowner tools. Tools are so cheap. Go to Lowe's, go to Home Depot, get the pre-made toolbox for $50. Put it in the closet and forget about it. Right after basic tools, especially if you're in any kind of rural area, have a chainsaw. Have a chainsaw. Know how to safely use it. And have bar oil and two-stroke oil. That was, I shouldn't have mentioned that during the fuel section, but that was enormous, man. All the places were super hard up for things, for the consumables of chainsaws. Oh my gosh, around here. You could not find files or chains or two-stroke oil and bar oil for anything around here. So making sure you got a chainsaw, you know how to safely use it, and that you don't need to go out and spend $1,000 on a 40-inch barred steel or whatever. I have a couple saws, but honestly, I have a steel, an MS, a 181, I want to say, 181C maybe, that has, I think, a 14-inch bar, tiny little saw, but it's got a lot of power for the bar length. And man, I beat the bejeebers out of that saw. And between that saw, a file, and some bar oil and stuff, man, that accomplished a lot of things during the hurricane, that little saw. So you want to have, again, if you live in an area with any kind of trees, you want to have a small chainsaw and be able to safely use it. If you're farther out and you have the property and you have the need in general, heavy equipment is huge. Heavy equipment was king here. And we're fortunate we have a Kubota. It's just a standard El Kubota. And the ability to put that kind of power to a problem is just, especially when heavy winds and trees down, and the need to dig out and things like that, was beyond critical. Our house, our drive is separated from the road by a pretty substantial creek. And so we have a big culvert that runs under our driveway. And I remember we had rain, I think, a lot of rain on the Tuesday before Helene. And then they were talking about this hurricane, and, I fortunately have a backhoe on the tractor, and I went down and before Helene, cleared a lot of the brush and debris out from the mouth of our culvert, which, builds up over time, and it happens. But I'm certain if I had not done that, we probably would have lost the culvert for the drive, and they would not have been able to get out, because that is the only way in and out of this property. So that's where having some heavy equipment, or at the very least, knowing somebody who does. There's a great joke out there, like, you don't want to be the guy who owns the boat. You want to be the guy who knows the guy who owns the boat. And there's something to be said for that. Tractors are not inexpensive. They're not inexpensive to maintain. So at least, if you're into the community thing, or you have a neighborhood, it's really good to have at least one person with a piece of heavy equipment that can move things. Because, there's some trees that you're just not going to be able to cut up, that you're going to have to either lift or move. Lots of folks around here had mudslides and earth moves and stuff like that. And the ability to do that sort of thing, to do that kind of work, was invaluable. I had my tractor out on 25 up here, and moved trees around and some other things to clear the roads, and it was a big benefit. So if that's something you can have, or you were thinking about, I would encourage you to do it. All right, so I talked about a lot of fun stuff. I want to shift here and talk about some of the slightly less glamorous things, consumables. So starting with the water. This was probably the biggest, longest issue for most of this region. As you may or may not know, Asheville, Buncombe County lost the main line from the reservoir that feeds virtually every municipal household in the city and the outlying areas, and it was down for months. So the need for bottled water was immense. And certainly, all the regional charities, National Guard, churches, Samaritan's Purse, all of them were just fantastic in making sure people had water. But goodness, we had friends in the city who were still on boil water notices, in December. It was crazy. So again, if you're moving to an area, you're looking at a house, some different things, I can't encourage wells enough, having private deep soil wells. The water thing just wasn't an issue for us because of that, because we had the well. Now, thankfully, we have both a well and we live pretty high up, so we did not flood here. There were definitely some people who did have wells, and if that wellhead, and it's a general PSA, if you're in a flood and your wellhead, the part where the well comes out of the ground, and it's somewhere on your property, I guarantee it's probably covered by a little fake rock. If that wellhead gets covered with flood water, do not drink from that well. It is not impossible that well gets contaminated. And in that case, again, you do not want to be drinking from that well. It needs to be shocked. There's a couple other things that you have to do. We were not in that circumstance, so having a well was, again, phenomenal. Like I said earlier, we had water the entire time. We were able to give water to some of our neighbors who weren't able to run their well pumps. Folks came over and showered and all that kind of thing. If you're not in a situation where you can have a well pump, big plats of bottles of water are obviously cheap, something everybody should have on hand all the time. Something a lot of folks sort of don't think about is the big 5-gallon jugs. You think of them in like office water coolers, the bubbler jugs. So at the very least around here, Lowe's, for example, they've got the trade-in program. I think it's, you pay a deposit and then it's maybe $5, maybe $10 for one of those. And while they are not sterilized, they last for a long time. And you can get a little apparatus. It's called a Dolphin. There's a couple, you can look it up on Amazon. It's a Dolphin pump. And it's a little hand pump and a spigot that clamps onto the top with a little siphon tube, clamps onto the top of that standard 5-gallon jug and lets you pump water out of them. We've had one of those on hand for camping for years. And had we not had water out of our well, we have a couple of 5-gallon jugs of water. And because we take them camping and different things. So if you're in a position where you can't have a well and you want sort of the most efficient way to store potable drinking water, I would definitely go that 5-gallon jug route and get a Dolphin. Or even in your house, you could go to, especially if you've got crummy municipal water, you can get a bubbler pretty easily. A water fountain, a water cooler, a bunch of different terms for them. But you can get those, that even some of them even have filtration built into them and some other cool stuff. But if that became the standard way you procure drinking water, then it would really not be that much of a change. And I think the standard for water consumption, I want to say, is 2 gallons a day per person. I believe maybe 1 gallon is the bare minimum, but just use that in your calculations for how many family members you have times however many days you want to be prepared for, and plan accordingly. Right next to water in the list of necessities is, well, obviously coffee. Hold on. Right next to water is obviously food and medication. And we had a couple of big ouchies here, and things we wish we'd done that I want to run through. So, amusingly, we had plenty of, we had a lot of freeze-dried food. And by virtue of our chest freezers, we did not have a human food problem, right? So that was fortunate. And again, if you can put together a system whereby you have a plan and the ability to keep a chest freezer cold, then, and whether that's running a generator, whether that's some sort of solar setup, doesn't matter. If you have that capability, then keeping bulk frozen food is a fantastic way to stockpile it and be prepared. And obviously then just rotate through it, right? Eat the chicken nuggets from last week today and get new ones or what have you. So for us, human food wasn't a huge issue. And a lot of folks, did need food, but it wasn't nearly as critical as water. That was the big one. Power came back, didn't take terribly long, and if you've got a propane stove, or heck, even a camp stove, you can reheat some SpaghettiOs pretty easily. But that wasn't a huge issue for us. I'll tell you, in the area, you don't want to be in the situation where the cupboard is bare every week, though, either. We have, depending on how you count them, we have several grocery stores here. At least one of them had their generators fail, and they lost every single piece of perishable food they had on their shelves. So it's not impossible. And I guess my point is, don't assume that, well, hey, there's a grocery store and the grocery store's got generators, so I can just go and buy food, right? Not to mention power and communication was out. No one could process credit cards, like all this kind of stuff. So just from a human food perspective, keep that in mind. You sort of think of two big phases when it comes to needing food, right? There's sort of the pantry raid phase, and that's where we had enough normal food on hand. And then after some certain duration, you then sort of move into the prepper food category of, all right, I'm starting to rehydrate my, package of dehydrated ground beef or whatever. We obviously didn't get into that. And I would encourage everybody to have enough food on hand where you don't have to get into that, because nobody wants to be mixing up egg powder, right? It's not anything anybody wants to do. Animal food was a big place we fell down, and a bunch of reasons for it. But we rely on Chewy, right? We have a Chewy subscription. We have a really big dog, and that dog eats a lot of food. And it just so happened that we were on the tail end of a food cycle for the dog. And so unfortunately, he's got a really specific diet, and, we're pretentious like that. So I had to be one of those people who, went to Lowe's and waited in line with my, little bit of cash that I had on hand to get some dog food. And you just don't want to have to be those people. So especially, there's no excuse to not stockpile dog food, especially if it's dry food, right? Stuff lasts almost forever. You can buy it in bulk. It's cheaper in bulk. There's no reason not to do it. Heck, we did it for all the other animals. We had plenty of chicken feed. We had plenty of cat food. We had plenty of human food. We dropped the ball on the dog food piece. So just keep that in mind. The just-in-time nature of a lot of our subscription society spoils us in a certain way. But in this case, it bit us pretty badly. And this was something that somebody else brought up in another video I saw that's very accurate. And it wasn't a huge deal for us, but you don't want to have to be washing dishes when you're eating. And just having paper plates on hand, man, I can see that being a lifesaver. Obviously, we had water. It wasn't a concern. We could wash our dishes. But man alive, we had a set of our neighbors who couldn't, had no way to power their well. They were doing the 5 bucket method or whatever it is, like the wash water, the bleach water, the rinse water, the whole thing. You don't want to have to do that. If you can avoid it, just have paper plates. For 10 cents at the grocery store, you can get 10,000 paper plates and not have to do dishes during that sort of catastrophe. In terms of consumables, the final way and this was probably one of the biggest things we fell down on, is we have a cat, or had a cat at the time. It was on a very specific seizure medication. And I won't mention it by name because I don't know what video platforms consider acceptable conversation these days. But it is a very restricted substance that the animal was on to control its seizures. And we ran out. And we were then thus in the position of trying to find a veterinarian who would call in a prescription for whatever class it is, class 4, whatever it is, for a heavy-duty narcotic in the middle of a catastrophe. And it's the type of narcotic that has to be a paper script. It can't be so that they can call it and tell the pharmacy you're coming, but you still need to pick up a paper prescription from the vet and take it to the pharmacy to get this stuff filled. And that was I think at the beginning of Helene, we had 3 days left. And so that was for the first 3 or 4 days. There was a whole bunch of scrambling, trying to find our vet. Went over there, helped them get their generators stood up, and they were very kind and wrote us the prescription. Then there was, one country pharmacy that had Starlink and could actually fill this narcotic prescription. Don't be in that situation. It sounds trivial because it's a cat, I understand. But this could just have easily been seizure medication for one of our kids. So, from a prescription perspective, make sure however you're able to do it, illegally, obviously, make sure you have, I would say, now we're at the point where we have a month supply. So we make sure that at any given point, we have a month of any of our prescriptions. And my wife's on a prescription. I am too. One of the animals is. You don't want to be in that scenario where you run out of a prescription and have to scramble to find a way to fill it in that sort of scenario. With everything else covered, there's a handful of other things I wanted to cover and talk through that didn't really fall into the other categories. So I just figured I'd do sort of a general prep section here. One of the biggest ones is cash. Have cash. There's no reason not to have cash. And thankfully, we did have a little bit. Probably not as much as we should have, but we did have a little bit in the area. Like I mentioned, communications go down. Comms go down. Telephone, internet, all those things means no one can process credit cards. Certainly no one's taking Apple Pay, right, in the middle of this kind of thing. So cash was king everywhere. Gas stations, grocery stores. I will hand it to the Lowe's, the North Buncombe Lowe's. God bless those folks. They were taking credit cards. They were writing paper receipts for credit cards. They were taking numbers, and they were letting you basically charge your credit card with them, and they were writing down driver's license numbers and stuff like that. They were taking them by hand. Those people are saints over there. But they were far and away the exception. So having cash on hand, and whether that's for retail exchanges or bartering, or hey, your neighbors, going to get gas and you can give them 10 or 20 bucks or whatever, have some cash on hand. Another of the most sort of cliche prep things, light candles. And we did not have any candles, but I'll tell you, one of the absolute MVPs of the whole thing for us were the LED lights of various types for cordless tool batteries. You picture whether you're Milwaukee M18s or a DeWalt or what have you, they all make some sort of LED light attachment for those batteries. Personally, I'm an M18 for all my trades and on the professional side, but inside the house, we use the Bauer junk from Harbor Freight. And we've got a bunch of those batteries, and they're dirt cheap, and they make little LED, flashlight grip style, trigger style flashlights, and these little sort of hanging jobbers. And I think we used one 5 amp hour battery, and one of their LEDs on that, and that is how we lit the entire living area of the house. I don't think we, the little 3 dots of capacity, so I don't know, 33%, something like that. We didn't go down by 1 dot for using that for the entire time. So if you're working up, how are you going to have light in the event of a catastrophe? I would avoid the candle cliche. This is from a safety perspective, all that kind of thing. And instead go the renewable route with those tool batteries and the associated lights. They were fantastic. In general, in this sort of situation, and I touched on this a little when I talked about not wanting to hurt yourself in this kind of disaster. You also don't want to be creating or changing things, trying to fix stuff in a time where if it breaks, no one will be able to fix it, or you won't be able to get the parts to fix it. And this is where that, knowing what you can and can't do, knowing your place on the Dunning-Kruger curve is really, really critical. There were definitely folks who, cooked the inverters on their generators by trying to do backfeeds that they were not qualified to do. There's obviously, I didn't hear any reports of any linemen getting injured, but that's obviously another big concern, right? If you don't know what you're doing, don't backfeed your own panel. If you don't know exactly what you're doing, don't, try to Heck, if you don't know how to start your generator, get a neighbor who does. And most of them, I understand, most of them are pretty brain free at this point. They got a knob, you turn it to start and then you yank on it, or a lot of them are key start. But the last thing you want to do is like completely flood your generator and then be unable to start it, and then lack the tools or the expertise to, drop the float bowl and drain it and all this kind of thing. So if you're not exactly sure what you're doing, don't try to the middle of a disaster is not the time to learn. If you really, going back to vehicle maintenance, right? If you really need to change the oil on your car, well, and you're bored, you got nothing better to do. Well, I'm gonna tell you what, you don't want to accidentally cross thread the oil filter on your car in the middle of this kind of disaster, right? Nor do you want to drain all the oil out of your engine only to realize you bought the wrong type at the store and now you have no oil in your car, right? You don't want to be in that situation in general. But you especially don't want to be in that sort of scenario when the regular support systems of an area are either strained or unavailable. I know this has been a long one, so I'm gonna try to do a quick summary of everything that I kind of went through here, such that I'll put the timestamp at the beginning, so you can skip right here if you don't want to listen to an hour worth of me talking about this stuff. But across the board, this has been targeted specifically for a flood and hurricane situation. Things that were critical: knowledge, understand all your critical systems, be useful. From a community perspective, don't rely on other people. Understand and be useful yourself. Be the one who's able to help, not the one who needs help. But also, don't go out there and put yourself at risk. Let the professionals do what professionals do. You don't need to go out and swing from trees with your chainsaw. On the gun side, everybody in this country should own a gun and be trained on how to use it and be able to carry it. And I would recommend you do that in any sort of situation, but certainly in a disaster situation. On the power side, have a generator. They're so cheap, there's no reason not to. And I would say even more than that, if you can afford it, and even if you can't, make the investment in a modicum of solar. Make yourself just a little more independent of the grid, and it will pay back in spades. On the communication side, don't assume the things that never go out will never go out, because we lost cell tower power, and it was a bummer. I would say there is no reason at this point to not have something like Starlink. On the consumable side, make sure you've got water, or make sure you've got a well and a way to run it. You don't want to be, again, in the scenario that Asheville was, where months and months on end without potable water. Food and medication, have food. If you have a freezer and you have a way to power it, stockpile food in that freezer. If you want to go the prepper route and get the, Ready Hour or whatever brand of freeze-dried goop, go that route. Make sure you got enough food for yourselves. Make sure you have enough food for your animals. And prescriptions. Make sure you have, a month worth of whatever prescriptions. Certainly if they're life-saving prescriptions, seizure meds, blood pressure things, stuff like that. You want to make sure you have that. Have fuel on hand. Have a plan. Understand that if you're using electricity to heat the house and to cook with, that you're not going to have it. So if you can, switch to sort of stasis types of fuel where you can have propane on hand. Have gasoline on hand. If you're going to stockpile gasoline, make sure it's ethanol free so that you don't just gel it and destroy all your stuff. Make sure you're staying on top of your transportation, that you've got a way to move yourself and your entire family safely. Keep the gas tanks full. Keep the services up to date. Make sure you have at least one vehicle that is somewhat all-terrain. It doesn't have to be a giant jacked up Jeep or anything. Just make sure you've got something other than the family sedan, so that if you have to drive, through some rough roads, you're able to do so. Make sure you have some cash on hand, a way to light up the house. We loved, again, the LED batteries for the tool, or the LED lights for the tool batteries. And don't go out and do anything wacky that you're not going to be able to fix, if something were to break. And in terms of fixing things, have a basic complement of tools. And have a chainsaw, especially if you're anywhere near trees. At some point, you're going to wish you had a chainsaw. Closing things out here, I'm going to get a little philosophical on this. And I've talked to my wife about this just to make sure it's not rose-colored glasses. And we made note of this even during the disaster itself. And granted, look, obviously we were far more fortunate than most people. Like I said, we had hot showers and food. We didn't have any damage to the house. Unbelievably fortunate. That said, I like to think that even if we weren't that fortunate, it was such a good time in the sense that it was hard. Like, it was difficult and a lot of work and going out and helping people and cutting trees up and moving stuff with the machine and fixing panels and whatnot. It was hard, but it was really easy at the same time. It was very, very simple. Like, just overnight, literally, life became so simple and so focused. And it was, I remember commenting on it at the time to my wife, and she agreed. And now in retrospect, we strangely look at it fondly, in that there was no distractions. There was no internet, there was no social media, there was no work. I was very fortunate, was able to take time off of work for all of this. That wasn't a problem. So it was this wonderfully focused. It was manic, and there was obviously stress and all those things, but it was also very calm. It just wasn't sort of the frenetic tempo and pace of life suddenly got changed, and the velocity of that change was startling and really made apparent the difference in the before and after. And just confirmed for us how much of life in general, our day-to-day life I'm talking about, and probably a lot of people's, is unnecessary. And it's unnecessary comfort, unnecessary pleasure, unnecessary distraction. There's just a lot of simplification. And I'll tell you, over the last year here since, that has been a big focus of ours here, is remembering the aspects of that storm that we did so enjoy. And obviously there was plenty of it that was awful and not enjoyable, and people lost their lives and their homes and goodness knows what else. But it was also so simple, and there was something enjoyable about that simplicity. And so if there's any one great life lesson learned from all of this, it's that there is a lot of joy to be found in difficult times, but there is also a simplicity to them, because you just have to do the next thing.